want to know which planet was causing your suffering? How about Earth?
Hey everyone, Brandflakes here, back with a new Shadowverse 2 video. For today's video, I want to go over my predictions for the decks that will show up and which type of pairings will show up for the upcoming Shadowverse Open that should be happening this weekend. I may make a video for each opener in case the results, or in case like the decks that show up are like, in case I was really off the mark, because then I had to like readjust my evaluation and also just like more content. But if I was on the mark, I'll make like either a much shorter video or maybe I'll just make an analysis of the Shadowverse Opens and explain how I was correct or, all that. So whatever, that's something for the future. Let's get into this actual video. Very briefly, I want to just make a disclaimer that I took all these decks except for this last one from the YouTube channel Jif. Jif is another Shadowverse content creator who is a much better player and a much better YouTuber than I am. And they took the top ladder decks from the Japanese players, I guess, and they just posted them and summarized them and gave a very generic game plan summary, which is really useful if you're somebody trying to learn the best deck in ladder right now. Now, I will say that just because a deck is good in ladder, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll translate to tournament play, and I'll cover that as I go through each deck, but I'll have the initial skeleton of the ladder decks on here, and then I'll talk about the cards I think will be replaced going into the actual tournament itself. So, starting off with the major villain of the set, we'll go with Rune. I think Rune will have by far the highest frequency, which I guess it's not very, like anyone can predict that. It'll have the highest frequency, but I have a feeling that the conversion rate, aka the rates of people in qualifiers to the finals themselves, will be very, very low. And the reason because of that is mostly because of the fact that I think people will either be building their Rune decks to counter Rune itself, or they'll be playing other decks that counter Rune naturally, like stuff like Forest, and even potentially stuff like a higher roll Abyss, because you can prey on Rune low rolling if you play Abyss, which is a topic to discuss when we're on the Abyss side. So the main cards that will signify whether or not it is a anti-Rune Rune deck is going to be Snowman Army. Now this is something that I only picked up from watching Jif's video, because at the bottom of each deck list, that guy put like a little blurb about how to play the deck and the reason why certain cards are in there, and Snowman Army was one of those cards. Snowman Army is a really good anti-Rune card because it forces your opponent to board lock themselves if you like Snowman Army a onion, and then the onion can't be cleared. So you can stall out your opponent really bad and prevent them from winning or playing their win cons like Kuon, Climb Kuon, or Crusaders Climb, etc. So it's a really, really good tech card for that matchup. But you'll notice that because we're running Snowman Army, we lose access to stuff like William, we lose access to stuff like Chaos or Flames of Chaos, and that can be really impactful for matchups that aren't Rune related. And for some matchups, like against Crest Haven, where Rune apparently is 9-1, that's not a big deal to be lacking those tech cards. But again, if there are people that are way more confident, like for example, bringing a more like Midrange Abyss, if there are people that are crazy enough to bring a Loot Sword deck into a very Loot Sword unfriendly meta, if people are playing stuff like Forest, which does have big minions you want to clear as Rune, not having access to things like Flames of Chaos and William can be a hindrance. So I think your Rune deck will either be your main tech against Rune, or you're going to be building it to be better against non-Rune decks, if that makes sense. So I think Snowman Army, again, I think if you're playing Snowman Army, that's your anti-Rune deck. And if you have that anti-Rune tech, then you'll play something like Crest Haven, which theoretically has a better matchup against everything except Roach. And then if you're playing Rune and you want to take more into the generic style of just like, oh, I want to counter everything but myself, then you'll pair it up with decks like Roach so you can beat the other Rune player more easily, I guess, because Roach is still favored into Rune by a pretty decent margin, I'd say, even after playing it myself a good amount. Now, the next deck I want to go over is going to be Crest Haven. Now, I briefly alluded to this when I was going over Rune a second ago, but Crest Haven is actually really, really bad into Rune, according to people that have watched scrims, played scrims, or even just watched the content for, Rune gameplay or Crest gameplay. And that's actually a big issue because, once again, Rune will be the most popular deck in the qualifiers. So the fact that you have to then, like, if you take both Rune and Crest Haven, the fact that you have to now play your Rune deck as your anti-Rune deck, ironically, means that your Crest Haven deck is even more susceptible to just making you lose the entire set, because if you lose the Rune Mirror matchup, which is very possible, like you have a singular set of tech cards against it, that means you've automatically lost your tournament run because you didn't respect Rune enough, ironically. So with that said, I do think Ruler Crusadus, which is the most interesting tech card here, is basically forced to be in every single Cresthaven deck, because Ruler Crusadus is probably the main way you cheese a win now against Rune. And that's not even because you use Crusadus better than your Rune opponent. It's purely because if your Rune opponent low rolls just a little bit, you can cheese a win out with Crusadus into like Blessing of Astaroth and killing your opponent on the next turn with your Marwyn pings, which is pretty outlandish to say the least, but that is really like the only way you win that matchup at like a remotely consistent rate, because Rune can out heal your constant pings. It can build big bodies to counter stuff like Shining Enchantment, and because of their own Ruler Crusadus climb shenanigans, and because of the fact that they'll often have Kuon to ping into one of your big boards, even your barrier doesn't do too much against Rune, because they'll just have ways to get around that barrier. Now obviously Haven can beat Rune, so you can be confident enough of just playing like a non-anti-Rune Rune deck and then Crest Haven, but I think as a tournament player, it is pretty irresponsible to not have a dedicated anti-Rune deck, especially if you have Crest Haven in your list. Now obviously there are a bit more tech cards that exist for the other decks in the meta, so stuff like Solefa is not a card that's super great into something like Rune, but you're playing it because in ladder, you see stuff like Loot Sword, you see stuff like Forest, you see stuff like Aggro, Abyss, Face Dragon. Like Solefa is really good against those type of decks. So you having the presence of Solefa is you basically acknowledging the fact that your Rune matchup is already lost, so you want your Crest Haven to be the reason why you win the other matchups that exist in the game. So I do think Solefa and Ruler Crusadus will be in every Crest Haven deck. And I don't know if it's responsible to build Crest Haven to maximize your chances of beating Rune. I think you only run Ruler Crusadus because that is your one chance of beating Rune. So you might as well have that extreme high roll scenario in the case that you low roll your Rune game and you need that win out. Now, the deck that I think should be the third most popular, despite the fact that I've been ragging on it recently in my newer videos, is Forest. Now, this is a deck list that is pretty fresh. Obviously, we have 2 new cards, surprisingly, through Wrecking Arrow and Gillenlease. And then this latter deck runs Olivia, but I think the reason why Olivia shows up is mostly just to surprise decks like Loot Sword and Aggro Abyss, because those decks don't have to respect big, like tall boards anymore, because those type of tall and wide boards have been really diminished in the current meta due to stuff like Midrange Sword being taken out back by the way that this set has developed and how it's shifted. So again, I think really good players can make Forest succeed just fine. Even the 2 makes it look like it's saying T0, which is definitely true if you're really good at the deck. And there is proof now that, I mean, I'm not surprised again, that if you're insanely good at Forest, it still performs just fine. I think the only thing I have in mind, and this isn't a dig at English-speaking Roach players, but I feel like Japanese Roach players are just better than English-speaking Roach players because they just play the game, like, unironically, like 3 times more than we do. And Roach is such a high skill cap deck that you kind of need that sheer amount of quantity of games to really master the deck. So I do think there will be like a very good fraction of people that bring Roach, and I think the people that bring Roach will have an exceedingly high and exceedingly above average conversion rate into the finals, because those are the people that are confident in their Roach skills. And if you're confident in Roach skills and you have the good luck to back it up with your good draw and your good planning and your good play, you will crush Rune and Crest Haven. So to me, Roach is by far the best deck to have as like a main piece, because if you play Roach, that means that all of the people that are playing Rune, like the people that are playing both Rune and Crest Haven, you have a very good chance of just naturally beating them. And so your second deck can be the deck that kind of covers Forest's weaknesses. So for example, supposedly stuff like Midrange Abyss is kind of annoying, stuff like Aggro Sword or Aggro Loot Sword is really annoying, stuff like Face Dragon is really annoying as Roach because you don't have the healing to support the face damage you take, and you can beat them, but you'd rather not take that chance in tournament. So you can take a deck like Crest Haven, where it has a much better play rate against those like more face value cards, or even decks like Abyss that, while aren't as favored as Roach is into stuff like Crest and Rune, it still has a good enough win rate because you can punish your opponent for low rolling while still having a good showing versus stuff like, again, Loot Sword and Face Dragon, because of the fact that it not only builds a board, it also has some healing to sustain their damage. So I think there's a good chance that Forest plus Rune, Forest and I think, okay, yeah, let me take that back. I think the most common pairing for Forest will be Rune, just because those two decks are so similar and a lot of people have practice stuff for it. But I really want to believe that if someone brings Forest and Abyss / Midrange Abyss, that they'll go really, really far. So I think that's my bold prediction, that Forest plus Abyss will be one of the best performing decks, or one of the best performing players, if that player is really good at Roach, which is possible. Like, again, I don't want to undersell English-speaking Roach players, because there are people that probably have put the time in and have gotten really good, and I don't want to disrespect that effort. So I'm just saying that the odds that Japanese players are better is a lot higher, just because, again, the more practice you have on Roach, the more likely you'll do good. Going on to the next deck, I think that Aggro Sword will not be played very often, just because it has such a feels bad, I guess, matchup into stuff like Rune and Abyss. Now, I do think it's a very, very competent and a very interesting call out to the rest of the tournament players to bring Loot Sword, because if these Rune decks and these Haven decks do not respect you bringing Loot Sword enough, you might just win the game because they don't have the answers for that. So these tech cards like Kagemitsu, like Zirconia, these cards are really good into decks that don't respect you, because the odds they have it cleared for you are way lower. So for example, like let's say that you're playing against the Rune deck, turn 6, let's say you play something like Devotee into Zirconia. In the past, what Rune would do is they would play something like William and wipe your board, and you'd feel terrible about it. But because they're not playing William anymore, now your Devotee plus Zirconia combo actually has massive pressure, because even if they play Kuon maybe clears most of it, but I think you'll have like 1 minion left over, and that's really, really bad for Rune, obviously. I guess now thinking about it, the math doesn't really work out to leaving everything up alive. I think you do clear everything with Kuon, but that's like a layer of RNG that they have to succeed at. Like, they now have to have Kuon, and they have to use the Evo on Kuon to clear your board, whereas in the past, they just play William, and they're up an Evo, up card advantage, and up everything. So it's a really big difference playing like a deck that is technically countered, but the opponent deck isn't running on the counter cards because they think you won't be present in the environment they're in. So Kagemitsu is kind of another idea of that, because if people aren't playing board clear as much, so again, for example, like with Haven playing Salefa, like I think you have to play Salefa because you have to respect the fact that if you're playing Rune without good mid-range or anti-aggro cards, your other deck has to have that respect so you don't die. Stuff like Kagemitsu would be good against stuff like Forest or Rune, because it is now value that might keep returning and actually be relevant, because your opponent, again, isn't clearing the board as much as they should be. And then taking things out like Vowels is interesting, because I think 3 copies of Vowels might be better than running like 3 copies of Supplicant, because again, with people not running mass board clears anymore, that means your Vowels might actually stay alive in his ambush state, because they don't have the AoE cards to actually hit through the ambush. Now, obviously, something like Haven has more than enough access to clearing the Vowels, which is why I think they took less of them. But once again, remember that Crest Haven is dominated by Rune. So there is an actual good chance that you either play an anti-Crest Haven deck, so again, for example, Rune, or you play Roach if you're confident in your Roach play. You can just counter Crest Haven, which is, again, the deck that has the most anti-Vowels utility, and play more Vowels so that somebody like a Rune player who has cut all their anti-Vowels tech will die to you faster, because you now have that extra 4 damage from ambush that you wouldn't have if they respected your deck. Now the other cards, Centurion, Tentacles will probably just still be present in Aggro Loot Sword, because they're very good closers. Like, we all know the nightmare of having a Centurion hit your face for 10 from set 1, or having a massive taunt wall just to have it reached over by Tentacle and chomp your face for 5, right? So I think this deck is pretty close to what would actually show up in the tournament, just because this is like aggro loot sword had to live in an environment where there's a bunch of anti-loot aggro or anti-loot sword. So this deck is probably already optimized for the tournament meta, but you could say that maybe they run even greedier on the aggro front because you don't have to run certain cards to beat actually no, I think this is just fine because everything that you'd want here fits into beating your opponent down faster while still punishing opponents for not respecting you. So this is pretty solid, I think. Now, the next deck list is going to be Mode Abyss. Now, there's two Abysses, Midrange and Mode. Obviously, the main difference will be the presence of Shamnacha. I think this deck will be a little less common, but the fact that Midrange Abyss already won a previous Shadowverse Open is pretty indicative of the hidden potential that Abyss has in tournament play. Now, the main reason I think Abyss will be played is because the consistency of Abyss is incredibly high. That isn't to say that when you high roll as Abyss, you're guaranteed to win like you would with something like Carbuncle, Roach, or Rune. But if you are just like averaging out average performance or like mid-roll performance, I think Abyss is comfortably higher than most other decks in the game. Just because the cards are so like stabilized in power, the curve is pretty even, I guess. Now that I'm looking at it, it is kind of crazy how many 2-drops there are, but I guess you have so much draw from Chaos Cyclone and Castle of Entwining that you having a bunch of early drops is way less punishing because you have more draw. So with that said, Mode Abyss obviously does have the higher value kind of win con through Shamnacha and double mode, which then allows you to do silly stuff like building crazy boards with Congregate of Untwining. You have stuff like RMV who are able to give you board clear with reach through the storm. And then Gensetsu and Yuzuki, which just are really, really good at closing out games where your opponent has ran out of fuel, and then you just set up a taunt wall and kill all their minions and heal, and they're like, well, I can deal with the first one, and then you drop the second one, and they're like, all right, top left, I'm out, right? So I think Mode Abyss is an interesting deck because I think if you're just trying to qualify, it's gonna be really, I think Mode Abyss and Midrange Abyss will have, again, extremely, extremely high conversion rates like Forest does. The question is just whether or not they win out in the long run. And I think what will happen is that people will play their Mode Abyss deck into decks like Forest, Loot Sword, and either the Mode Abyss Mirror or Dragon. And then as a last resort, they'll play it into Rune. So for example, if you brought Crest Haven and Mode Abyss for some reason, you would use Mode Abyss as your anti-Rune matchup, and then you just hope that the Rune player low rolls and you just smack them, and then move on to the next deck. And then hopefully Mode Abyss wins there, but obviously if you lose, you have your Crest Haven as your backup entry to that. Now, I guess just jumping down briefly to Midrange, just so you guys can see the deck. Midrange is obviously pretty similar to last set. The main update is going to be Barrel. And the reason why Barrel is really interesting is because you suffer less from the self-ping due to Gildenlace being in the game. And so that's just another chunk of healing that you didn't have before that stabilizes you way harder than you would otherwise. And obviously Barrel is, if you've experienced last set, you know that Coin Barrel is like one of the scariest things to see. And even though this is an aggro and they can't super capitalize off of the start, if they get Coin Barrel and then you can't respond to that barrel, they can get 6 damage in really early. And against something like Mode Abyss, where every turn they're dropping a threat over and over and over again, and they have late game closers like Cerberus and Odin, you have to, it really modifies your gameplay and your state of mind, and having to deal with the pressure of, oh, if they have Odin, I lose, I have to play around that, just because you took 6 extra damage early on, is pretty stressful, obviously. So I think I really want to say this style of Midrange Abyss is actually worse in tournament play, because Congregate of Untwining is way more powerful and way more of a game closer with the Shamnacha activation. And once again, because I think the really top decks will be playing around you actually have a mid-range deck, being mid-range isn't as big of an advantage as it could be, because stuff like Crest Haven will be playing Salefa, stuff like Rune should have stuff like William and Flames of Chaos, so your value and your risk of taking mid-range, like strict mid-range, is diminished because it's like, oh, they, like my opponents really thought about their deck choices, and they mitigated the risk of losing to mid-range by bringing anti-mid-range tools, because they were like, oh, big brain, I knew you were going to do that before you did, your blah 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 blah, you guys know the meme. The final really big deck I think will show up is going to be Ramp Base Dragon, and this is kind of a homage to the last guy that won the Shadowverse Open, where they apparently didn't realize they couldn't fix their deck after they submitted it, so they were forced to bring Ramp Base Dragon, and they ended up winning the entire thing. Because as it turns out, Ramp Base Dragon is pretty similar to Abyss, where it just has a very strong, consistent game plan. And the main lose con for Ramp Base Dragon is, I think, playing against Loot Sword, because Loot Sword just has a faster tempo. But I think Ramp Base Dragon has a better win rate against the more common decks in the meta if they get it off. And the reason why Ramp Base Dragon feels really bad to play on ladder is mainly because you have to play against so many Loot Swords over and over again that just kill you because they played Zirconia, and sadly as Ramp Base Dragon, you have no actual good Zirconia answers. You have Seasoned Merman, but that's like a singular card you have to counter Zirconia. Like Galmu is not countering Zirconia unless you get really lucky, and even then you're still leaving minions up. So I think if you have the confidence, or you just simply bring a deck that counters Loot Sword, you can actually take in Face Dragon. So something like Crest Haven plus Face Dragon, for example, might be good. Rune plus Face Dragon, pretty standard stuff. Like you could do that just so you clear the really bad matchup of Loot Sword in case it shows up, and then just hope you get the good hand and good curve against every other deck and then win out. So with that said, I do think this card, I saw this is in the top ladder deck, and I'm fairly certain this is an anti-Loot Sword card. So I think Charetta will be completely cut from all tournament lists for Face Dragon. I think what they'll play instead of Charetta is probably more stuff along the lines of Fireworm, maybe a third copy of Genesis Dragon, maybe a third Leo Fang, just to have some slightly better consistency with your Evo and Ramp game plan. I think, again, the main reason why you bring stuff like Charetta is purely because you want to make that Loot Sword matchup slightly better, but since you're in tournament play, and since you can just completely tune your other deck to counter Loot Sword, worst comes to worst, you no longer have to kind of make your Face Dragon deck quote-unquote lower quality to counter the decks that would otherwise kill you. So going on to the two for fun decks I have in here, I think there is a tiny chance that Izudia Roach or Izudia Forest can show up in tournament play, but because this deck is almost entirely meant to counter Loot Sword, you have to basically be hard calling out every other play in the tournament and going, yeah, I knew what you were thinking, and I knew that you thought you knew what I was thinking, so I'm actually going to bring Izudia Forest so that I can counter all of you dirty Loot Sword players that decide to try and metagame out everyone else. So I think Izudia, if it does get into finals, I don't think it's going to have a very good chance unless a bunch of other Loot Swords made it into finals as well. I think there will be people playing this deck because they want to do the funny, and there has been rumors and I guess comments that Izudia Roach or Izudia Forest is good versus Runecraft and Haven. But I think as the set has gone on, that's been more or less proven false. Like, the main value of Izudia Forest is to be anti-Egg Portal, it is to be anti-Loot Sword, it is to be a better matchup against something like Face Dragon. And one of those, aka Face Dragon, I think will be more common in the ladder. And obviously Loot Sword might be as well, but because, again, Rune and Haven will be so consistent, I don't know if you can bring Izudia Roach safely, or Izudia Force safely, especially since the deck you would want to pair Izudia Roach with, aka Carbuncle Roach, I don't think you can play two of the same craft in one tournament, so you can't even bring the best foil to your deck if you're trying to play Izudia Roach, or Izudia Force. I keep saying Izudia Roach, but yeah, I think it might be fun seeing it, but unless somebody finds a very hard counter to Rune and Haven, I'm not sure if Izudia Forest will have that great of a showing. And then, just as a final note, I will be very surprised if someone really plays this deck, but I think this deck is I think it's a fun tournament deck, explicitly because nobody will mulligan for it and nobody will have the proper prep for it, and that's going to be Stormhaven. Now, I only say this as somebody who's been losing to Stormhaven because of absolutely greedy mulligans as Carbuncle Roach, but the Mulligan versus Stormhaven and the Mulligan versus Cresthaven are two totally different beasts. Unless you're playing something like Aggro Loot Sword or like Mode Abyss, if you're playing something slower like Carbuncle Forest, like Izudia Forest, like Cresthaven, like Rune, you always want to go for these slower, like greedy win cons because of how Cresthaven works. If you don't mulligan for the early game though, what ends up happening is that Stormhaven just kind of kills you on turn 7 because you're like, oh wait, they dropped a Tiger and I have no response to it. Oh, they dropped Minyu with Darkhaven Grace, and now this like 7-4 Minyu is hitting me in the face and I can't do anything about it. Or it's like, oh, I didn't clear this Tiger on turn 2, so now they coined out Apostle of Veracity and now they're hitting my face with a massive Tiger for fun on turn 4 because I didn't have the mulligan set up properly. So I think tournaments are absolutely beautiful because really like out of the box, really creative players can pull stuff out like this deck. I don't even think this is by far not the best deck for this concept, by the way. I just threw this together as a proof of concept. Like, you can make these type of decks and you can have a really good showing because the other deck that exists for that class is just the totally opposite side of what you want to mulligan for, and you can punish that by playing, again, the totally opposite side. So really interesting ideas going on here that you could pull out in tournament. So yeah, that's gonna be the video. If you guys want to talk about your own predictions for the tournament, go ahead. I love seeing all of your analyses. I think it's kind of funny seeing my YouTube channel, I don't know if devolve or evolve is the right term, but seeing it go from me, actually playing the game and trying to explain how Roach works, to me just giving up and going like, I'll consume the content, I'll watch gameplay, I'll think about the game and actually play it, and then give my thoughts on it. It's pretty nice. I like this channel vibe. It's definitely what I prefer as a content consumer and creator. So yeah, thanks for watching guys. Have a good day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.